Okay, I don't know whether that worked. Possibly may not have worked, so let me do it again. There we go. That's the way to do it. Apologies. So we're just going to have a conversation about consciousness of water, telepathy. Are you there, Lenny? I can see you.
Good afternoon, Dennis. How are you doing today?
I'm good. It's good to speak to you again, man. I've just set up the events in my bathroom from Wednesday. I know we've had a conversation previously about consciousness of water, so it seems to tie in quite nicely with that. Have you got any thoughts?
Yes, I think that the water, by being attracted to you and you sitting in water, somehow managed to amplify your field. And so I'm not quite sure. I know that structured water is when water tends to take on alignment to make it uh, so that it has degrees of freedom that can hold memory and transfer information. So I think that the idea that you were in a bath at the time that your telepathy worked somehow has to be related.
Yeah, that's what I thought as well. That's what I thought. Um, I have had kind of vague telepathic experiences before, but they were connected to Reiki. So they were connected. So the way I think this might be working for me, I can't say it works for like this for anybody else, but the way I think it works for me is that because I've been doing the Reiki distance healing thing for so long, I've got so many assumptions about being able to make connections with people in my head that it just happens. It happens automatically sometimes. And Reiki kind of acts as a carrier. I think it might be some kind of carrier wave that you can add thoughts to. Uh, I'm not sure whether that's even possible, but that seems to be the way it works in my life anyway at the moment.
I have a different philosophical bent from where you're coming from. I don't have experience with Reiki, but I do have experience with a philosophy called Tree that is based on the limbic system of trees, which is analogous to the limbic system of humans. And it uses 8 different concepts in order to establish a groundwork that these concepts are all different but related. And mind is one of the 8 concepts. So the idea that mind relates to things like power or flow or mass to me seems like a natural, because all of the things that we do can be grasped as combinations of pairs of concepts. So the 8 concepts start with mass, go into form, and then flow, power, love, sound, mind, and void. So you can have the concepts paired as in mass minding, or you can have the concept pairs as mind massing. And the permutations of 8 taken 2 at a time give you 64 different possibilities. And so when you start thinking about the possibilities, taking 2 at a time, it opens up a structure that really does allow you to take your thoughts and catalog them in a way that you can almost structure your thinking.
Right. So I mean, it's to some extent, I think combinations of concepts like that do change the kind of shape of of your consciousness in a way. They add something to the normal shape that wouldn't otherwise be there.
Yeah, I think that when you focus your intention on something, that gives it more energy, but it's not necessarily energy the way that we measure energy, where you're talking about motive power as energy, but it's more that the thoughts create the existence, exactly what you were talking about. The mind being everything is that if you can't conceive of it, then you really can't imagine and make it into something that's real.
Yeah, I mean the telepathy in the bath incident, which I think I might find another name for at some point, because that sounds ridiculous. It was accidental, but I mean I've done things like this before where people have asked me to guess colours that they're thinking of, and I've done that. I've also done like experiments where I was guessing the gender of unborn babies at one point. There's all sorts of things that I've done that I'm not claiming I'm any good at, but I've tried lots of different things that all involve kind of like mental sensitivity to things that are physical, or mental sensitivity to things that are mental.
It's difficult to create tests that demonstrate things like telepathy on intention because the regular life that happens always brings up different things. And so you need to calculate the probability of something happening and then do your test and show that you've gotten more than what's probable. So a lot of the psychic experiments that have done in the past involve flipping coins and predicting them, or looking at a picture that's on a card and having somebody guess. And if you say have five different pictures on a card, that's a 20% chance that they'll guess right. If somebody's guessing at 24%, that's statistically significant, but they're still missing most of their guesses. So a lot of people say if you can't do it 100%, there's no demonstration of the reality. But in fact, if you look at the probability of getting a 24% hit rate compared to the 20% hit rate, it does seem that there's significance in that.
Yeah, I mean Karen's just suggested water immersion telepathy as a way to describe what was happening, which I think is pretty accurate. And it makes me think that there might be a possibility of doing telepathy experiments in a hot tub at some point, which could also be interesting. But the idea that the mind can influence the physical world is something that I'm prepared to buy into. It's certainly a possibility, quite a high possibility.
I guess that designing the tests to demonstrate that are difficult, but when you notice it serendipitously just from paying attention to the surroundings that you're dealing with, it becomes a reality. And once you've noticed that as the reality, it's hard to change away from it, isn't it?
Absolutely, because once you've got one synchronicity, you're more likely to get another one, I think. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy after that.
So, a lot of what we find happens to us in the reality is depending on our mental status. And that makes it imperative to have a good outlook on things because if you're taking an outlook that just depresses everything, you're going to depress yourself.
Yeah, not only that, when people talk about placebo effects in health, what they're talking about is things that make people healthier. But there's also a nocebo effect as well that makes people sick. So it's all to do with mind. So if your mind can influence your body in that way, and we're assuming there's some kind of field of consciousness that we act upon. Not act upon is not the right word, but like an extended mind. That's the idea. So your mind doesn't stop at your body; it extends out a few feet away from you. The odds are reasonable that you might be able to influence your environment at least to a few feet. I mean, the door to my front door is about 6 feet away from the bath, so it's not that far away. So extended mind 6 or 7 feet would cover that.
Well, how long do you figure your personal aura extends?
Mine, I can move it in and out a little bit because I've been experimenting with this for quite a while. But I can extend my energy field quite away if I put my mind to it. But under normal circumstances, about 3 or 4 feet maybe.
Yeah, I find that if somebody comes into my personal space, it makes me feel uncomfortable. And that when you get a close packed system, I definitely do not find that I like being close packed with people. But on the other hand, the social distancing that we're playing with now sort of moves people so that their auras don't intersect. And I wonder how much intention can be used to allow auras to intersect when the distance is greater than a couple of feet.
Oh yeah, you can expand it a little bit if you want to make contact with somebody. If you want to make a kind of like an unspoken conversation, you can do that with your mind. It's a visualization exercise, just to expand. Start with your body and expand out to the level that you want.
Yeah, yeah, I've done some thinking on extended auras, and I've also watched people use a technique called Kirlian photography, in which you can actually take a snapshot and see the auras.
Yeah, I've
But
had, I've had a couple of Kirlian photographs over the years.
yeah, I tend to stay away from having my aura photographed. I just didn't feel right to look at something like that in a picture. But I have been part of seances and other things done by spiritual people that sort of collect auras into a group aura and attempt to use the group aura to do something.
Yeah, I remember years ago I met somebody at a mind body spirit fair who had a gadget they called gas discharge visualization. It's somebody called Korotkov came up with it in Russia. But what they were basically doing was taking the same thing the Kirlian photography does, which is the conductivity of your skin. I think so. The level of electrical conductivity is how they start, and then they build up a picture from that. And gastric discharge visualization took that, and then it associates that with the meridians of like the Chinese meridian system. So it puts uh, the image based on 12 meridians rather than seven chakras. But that was very, very accurate for me. It was more accurate than Kirlian photography.
Yeah, I sometimes wonder how the definitions of things can influence the things that they're defining. I know that as a scientist, my background in chemistry creates a whole visualization of reality based on atoms forming molecules that there is no evidence for in the real world. And yet, when we go into a chemistry lab and we try and do synthetic chemistry, and make the same stuff that nature can make without a problem, it's something that's possible to do, but often takes years to come up with a synthesis for a natural compound and demonstrate that it is the same thing as you would find in nature. And then there's a lot of people that question whether a synthetic compound made in the laboratory has the same intrinsic characteristics as what was found in nature.
Yeah, I mean, a natural compound would have other things associated with it, so it's associated with a particular environment. And you could say, if you want to use the analogy, you could say energetically the compound itself includes the environment to some extent.
Yeah. The compound that I generally think about for laboratory production is a compound called Taxol. It was derived from yew bark and it was used to treat some sort of disease in the 2000s. And I there was a lot of yew trees that people were going out taking the bark off of and killing the trees that made it a high demand item, so that the big pharma companies started trying to make Taxol in order to relieve the burden on yew trees. But when big pharma makes something, they make an isolated compound, whereas when nature makes something, there's a whole slew of different compounds that are related to the compound of interest that are partially formed or partially degraded, that interact and have a lot more going on. And so I like to use chemistry as a model for natural systems, but I understand that natural systems, when they work on a basis of chemistry, we don't have the complex understanding of how nature actually does what it does.
No, and there's a complexity there that's if you're picking out one specific thing for a scientific experiment, you lose the complexity around it simply because you have to be able to study something.
Yeah, the definition of the terms that you're using and the hypothesis, what you're inquiring about, tend to limit your subject, because if you go at the subject completely unlimited, you don't really have a handle on things. And if we think rabbit holes in the real world are difficult, imagine the rabbit hole you would have trying to do an experiment where you couldn't control the conditions.
Yeah, I mean, so it makes doing water immersion telepathy experiments a bit more complicated than I want them to be, really. Uh,
Well, they don't have to be. Once you define what your protocol is going to be, you will be able to repeat that same protocol several different times. And once you've got three, four, five trials using the same protocol, now you've got results that can be compared to each other, and you can start revising your protocol based on what you found. But each time you change the protocol, you have to start again from scratch and looking at the results, because the conditions that they were collected in are not exactly the same, and it becomes a matter of comparing apples to oranges if you're not doing the same test each time.
yeah, no, I get that. You would have to repeat it because it's one variable's changed, or two or more variable than one variable's changed in the way the experiment's being done.
Yeah, science puts a lot of constraints on how it develops its protocols, and it's really important to have a solid protocol that each of the people doing the experiment follow. But when you are doing the experiment, You can see things that don't necessarily make sense in the protocol, and you have to have the discipline to work the protocol and not make the change, but note the change so that the protocol can be revised for the next set of experiments. So I think that a lot of what's presented by the media and by academia as scientific results is more a result that's forced by the protocol that was used than true science investigation. And science, as I learned it, was that you form a hypothesis and then you try and defeat your hypothesis and demonstrate how it can't be true. But the reward system that we have given scientists these days is that if they want to keep their funding, they had better be speaking truth. So there's a major conflict in how universities do science. And I think that the science that we get in this day and age is bought and paid for. And so figuring out how to put more philosophy back into science is definitely a worthwhile partnership for us to be discussing.
Yeah, I'm interested in like basic fundamental assumptions that people make, that I make in particular, because if I don't know that they're there, they can influence my entire life.
And once you have an assumption that you've made, it becomes fairly easy to test it and see if it's valid or not. But you could test an assumption and find two or three times it works. And then the next time it doesn't work, it doesn't necessarily invalidate the assumption, but a lot of times there's multiple pathways that can exist. And if the conditions change just enough, you can start seeing a second pathway that's different from the original pathway. So if you assume you found the right way of doing something because you've done it a couple times and it seemed to work, you get this one time when it then doesn't work, and it's not worth throwing out the baby with the bathwater. You have to really look at the conditions and validate that the experiment was controlled enough to demonstrate what you're questioning, but then come up with follow-up experiments in order to do things. Now, science has a real problem in that everything scientific has to be inanimate, not be part of life, because life has its own mind and will decide to do things differently than a scientist wants to hold it in its box and study it. And so I really think that it's necessary for the whole society to go back to fundamentals and question a lot of the assumptions we make and look at things that we thought we knew and weigh them again so that we can tell whether the things that we have been taught by the academic system are actually validated by the things we have learned from experience in the here and now.
Yeah, I think it's important to be flexible enough that you can just ask the question. I mean, ultimately, the answer is going to be what the answer is. If you're asking a question, you can't assume that you know the answer to begin with.
No, but you can make a guess at the answer and validate it. So I guess what you need is to be able to design a test that is falsifiable, that you know has an answer that can be true or false.
Yeah, that's Karl Popper, I think, isn't it? That's the way he defined scientific investigation.
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead then.
I, I find that the parade of scientists and doctors that are being presented by the media is quite disingenuous. And I really have trouble having people talk at me and tell me how things are where I do not get to question and interact in the space that they're coming from. And there has to be a revision of how we do media. It seems like a radio show with an interactive chat can take us way further along in a discussion than having one person paraded out with a mask and telling us that we have to be in social isolation. Oh, and
Yeah,
that person has a profit motive.
yeah, no, I agree that I've always been a fan of chat rooms. I've been a fan of chat rooms for many, many years in various places, and it's sometimes because people are just open when they're talking to each other, it becomes you learn more. You learn about the person that's doing the talking, but you also learn about how people think a lot more because they're just being open with you.
Yeah, and it's important to accept different ways of thinking. Just because somebody thinks differently doesn't make it right or wrong. And I get more validation when somebody who doesn't think like I do comes up with the same solution than I do with me talking to a choir of people that want to learn to believe the same things I believe.
Yeah, I mean it's the I mean it's the combination of people that makes the conversation, and it's the combination of assumptions that behind the conversation that are behind the people, if you like. You bring that with you into a conversation. So sometimes you find out what people have assumed about the world because the conversations are spluttery. They're like jagged rather than smooth. The level of flow changes with different assumptions is what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, yeah. And the belief system creates the reality from the mind out. And so when you have things that really stretch your belief system and turn out not to be true, you have to go in and out back into that and test the assumptions that you thought were valid. But I'm not sure that truth has to be universal. It could be relative to the person who is speaking the truth, so that my truth doesn't necessarily have to be your truth. But if we agree on a truth and then sometime later find out that it's not true, does that invalidation affect both of us? Or is it your truth is still true to yours until you buy into the evidence that it's not true?
I'm not sure about that. I think time is a factor in truth, and truth is a factor in time because the word's the same in Greek. I had a thing about time for the last few years, and then I moved on to truth, and it's the same word in Greek. The word is ousia or ousia. So there's some kind of interaction between the two. There's some kind of significant, um, like there's a conjunction between the two things. They look like they're separate concepts, but they're actually possibly the same concept.
I have trouble with the current concept of time. And when we say that time is a function of other things, we've got this system that measures things over time. And so time is a built-in function of those things that we create. And so to tease time outside of the equation and look at it means that we can't use techniques that measure things like rate, because a rate is a frequency over time. Now, time is measured in frequency based on a vibration of a cesium atom, but frequency is measured as a function of time. And to me, that just seems like a conundrum, because how can you measure frequency as a function of time and time as a function of frequency? Isn't that a closed loop?
Yeah, it would make them essentially you're measuring the same thing and calling it two different words, or is that the way that would work? Is that right? That's what I've got in my head.
Yeah, and it makes it so that you've jobbed your system and that you really don't have a dependent variable and an independent variable. You've got both variables being the same thing because you've linked them in such a way that their construct is based on each and the other. So when I look at frequency and I look at time, I've now taken to looking at both of them as fractals that are embedded in each other. And we use time, a second, a minute, a day, a year, but there's nothing that says that your year is the same length as my year, except the construct of a calendar that puts us all on the same annual year-to-year basis. So I tend to wonder if a improperly constructed calendar like the Julian calendar that we're using now is one of the major problems that we have locking us into the thought space that we're currently in this society.
Yeah, and you look at what happened when they moved from the was it Gregorian to the Julian calendar. There was riots going on all over Europe when that happened. They assumed it was the end of the world because there was 11 days went missing somewhere. There was a whole lot of psychological effects of that, and that's the interaction between uh, time measurement of time and human psychology.
Yeah, plus I wonder if they haven't added 1,000 years into our current calendar. There's some people who make a very good case that the one digit that was in front of all the years in the last 10 centuries was actually originally an I and before that a J, and it was more of a marker to relate it to previous calendars than it was a count of years. So that if the count of years is actually off, a lot of the history that we're presented doesn't flow in the way it was presented to us. So, how do we question history when we're not living through those times? Or even when we are living through those times, can we question the history of the 1960s and 70s because it was presented to us as televised and it would have been easy enough to Photoshop what was on the television to give us the impression that it was something that it really isn't?
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to question history, then starting by questioning the way that it's measured that's a foundational thing, isn't it? If you that's probably the first step. And if we are missing 1,000 years, then there's an awful lot of history that we're being told existed that actually probably didn't exist.
Yeah, I get to some practical questions about current history as we know it, like how did the Renaissance spring directly from the Dark Ages?
Right. Okay. Yeah. The limited amount that I know about the Renaissance was about rediscovery of Plato's um, dialogues. And there was a Hermetic thing going on. They found some Hermetic texts that were translated from Arabic into Italian, I think, and they found some Platonic texts as well. But the I think it was the Borgias. The Borgias were in charge in this particular bit of Italy, and was it Marcello Ficino was the translator, but he was told to translate the Hermetic texts before the Platonic text. I think that's more or less the established narrative of how the Renaissance started.
Yeah, history tends to be written by the people in control, and it makes me wonder how many times history has been changed just by leaving out pertinent positives and pertinent negatives, as Karen likes to say, because the flow of what we're taught doesn't seem to stack up to the structure of reality as we know it anymore. But how do you step back and get outside the structure of the current reality when we're all in this reality together? And if we change the reality mentally one at a time, we don't have a correlation of a sense of what is common.
Yeah, I mean the only thing that we would have in common is maybe one or two base assumptions, and everything else is personal after that, because it's based on your location and who your parents were and where you went to school and all those sorts of things. There's a huge amount of personal information that's specific to an individual that can't that I don't can only be. It's basically a reinterpretation of the foundational assumption. Or let me think about this a little bit more, because that's not quite what I'm wanting to say. So
Yeah, I think we have a problem that common sense is anything but common.
right, yeah, that's partly it. It's like the amount of limitation placed on the individual in relation to the base assumption. The limitations are around the location of the person or whatever, and all the cultural things that go with it. Those limitations are the things that stop you from seeing the underlying assumptions.
And those underlying assumptions also change over time. And so that what is presented to us currently from the university system is vastly different from what that same system presented to us 40 years ago.
Yeah, or even 1,000 years ago. Uh, right, that's my phone going, but I'm going to ignore it because I want to continue my train of thought. Yeah, so yeah, I mean, up until I don't know when it was, maybe 1500, Aristotle was the person that was being taught in universities, and then he discovered these Platonic dialogues, and the structure of uh, how people think changed.
Yeah, I think that the construct that we call science was something that in the past was called alchemy, and the alchemical philosophers had it all together as a universal nature of something that made sense, but that science came along and started partitioning things into chemistry versus physics versus biology versus, and they kept subdividing and subdividing things until everything became its own compartment. And then each of those compartments created their own language, and that we've got almost a Tower of Babel language problem in that people speaking the same words don't necessarily have the same meaning behind those words, and the interpretation from one field to the next isn't as clean as we're led to believe.
Yeah, I think the words change with time and with context as well. So there's a whole lot of things around language that need to be sorted out if we're going to be able to have a sensible conversation between like 100,000 people who are all living in different countries and different cultures and different assumptions.
Yeah, and I don't think we get those 1,000 person conversations going very well. I think that a lot of the construct of education is more of a construct of indoctrination where people are told what they need to know to get along to practically live, but that the truth of the reality that we're presented isn't actually discovered in complete depth.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing. Language has always been a tricky thing. Um, we're coming up to the end of the show, Lenny. So do you want to give people an idea of where they can find you online?
Yeah, they can find me on Minds, but I'm not really being a very good online presence yesterday or any longer because I put up thoughts of the day, but I'm not really trying to put up too many things in depth right now because I think there's a lot of noise on the internet and that talking from my own position of truth, I I don't necessarily convey things that other people can accept. And so instead of going into depth and trying to educate, I'm more pulled back now to watch and learn as opposed to thinking that what I have to offer is of fundamental value. At some point, I'll end up teaching chemistry again, but to find me on Minds, just run the 4 words, the Mad Doctor Thyme, Thyme for time, all together, and that's my handle on Minds.
Okay, cool. That's easy enough to find it. And you can find me at the moment on the place that I'm doing the most is freeassociationradioshow.com. Uh, all the videos that I'm watching and all the thoughts I'm having tend to go into that particular blog, and I put together a classified ad directory on there as well, which I might take off. But there's potential for other things happening there as well. So just a reminder that the station's listener supported. So if you want to make a contribution, you can just come to the chat room and engage with the people there, or you can engage with us via Patreon and maybe give us a monthly donation to help keep the servers running.
So that was freeassociationradio.com.
Freeassociationradioshow.com.
Oh, okay.
I bought loads of domain names, but that's the one that I've stuck with for the time being. Um, but I move around a little bit on the internet, so there's 2 or 3 different projects going on, and I'm still active on the Reiki Discord server that I've had for a couple of years as well. So you might be able to find me there. It's called Reiki Initiation. If anybody's on Discord and they want to have a conversation about Reiki, that's the place to do it. So once again, thanks, Lenny. It's been a good conversation. It gives me more food for thought, and I'll be back next week. It's 11 o'clock on the East Coast in the States, 4 o'clock in the UK. I'm going to more or less wrap that up here. I don't like talking over music, so we'll just wrap it up there, and we'll let the music come in as it wants to.
Appreciate being able to talk with you again, Dennis. Thank you.
No worries at all. We'll probably see you next month at some point.